Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to our second session at the fourth annual conference on the Ummah at CIGA. Our host for our moderator for this second session is Dr. Sami Al-Arian, the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Dismantling University. Dr. Sami.
Thank you very much, Uveys, and welcome everybody to our second session. Thank you for joining us. Our second session today for this important conference is going to have three very distinguished academics, professors, and intellectuals. The theme is political authority and authoritarianism, examining the historical record, in which we will start launching this conference by having this discussion. Our first speaker is Dr. Humeira Iqtidar. Dr. Iqtidar joined King's College in London in 2011. She studied at the University of Cambridge, McGill University in Canada, and Quaid Azam, a university in Pakistan. Before joining King's, Dr. Iqtidar was based at the University of Cambridge as a fellow of King's College and the Center of South Asian Studies. She's currently working in two book projects. The first focuses on non-liberal conceptions of tolerance through an engagement with 20th century Islamic thought, while the second, titled Justice Beyond Rights, builds on her research with refugees and migrants from the tribal areas of Pakistan. Dr. Iqtidar will talk about authority, legitimacy, and sovereignty in Islamic thought. Our second speaker is Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl from the UCLA School of Law in Los Angeles. Dr. Abou Fadl is the Umar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the School of Law at University of California in Los Angeles, and a founder of the Institute for Advanced Usuli Studies. He's the author of many books and articles on Islam and Sharia, on Islamic law, as well as Islamic jurisprudence. He has many books, among which are Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern Age, The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of books, Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority and Women, and so on. He has many, many books. MashaAllah, he holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Yale University and a JD from University of Pennsylvania Law School, as well as master's and PhD in Islamic law from Princeton University. Our third presenter is Dr. Mahmoud Mamdani from Columbia University in New York. Dr. Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at Columbia University. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974 and specializes in the study of African history and politics. His works explore the intersection between politics and culture, particularly in Africa, as well as during the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the history and theory of human rights. Dr. Mamdani was also a university professor in many countries, including, especially in Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa. He has many, many, many books, including Savior and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War and Terror, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, the most famous one, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, as well as many, many others. We are really very blessed to have all of them today in one setting, discussing very important topic, as I said, to inaugurate this conference. Each speaker would be given about 22 minutes to present, to give their presentation and thoughts, and then we will get engaged in questions and answers, in discussion. Feel free for those, since we're doing this virtually, this is very unique. We're talking about 4 different cities on 3 continents. But at any rate, please write your questions or your comments. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We have someone designated to send them to me through chat. Also for our speakers, I will put these questions in the chat. So if you activate your chat in the bottom, you will also see some of these questions as we go along. Again, thank you, and we'll start with Dr. Humeira. Dr. Iqtidar. Unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Al-Arian, for the invitation and for your whole team for putting this together. And as I mentioned earlier, I feel particularly privileged to be sharing this panel with two scholars whose work has been very helpful to me in my own thinking as well. I mean, they're very different kinds of scholars, and the limitations of my scholarship are mine, not theirs, but their work has been very helpful in my own thought. I realize also that going first means that one carries a certain burden, and that burden is partly to stay on track and in time, so that I don't eat into other people's time. So I would very much appreciate. I have a clock here to keep myself timed, but I would also appreciate if you could give me a signal when it's about 2 minutes left to go.
I'll remind you at 5 and remind you at 2.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. The title of my talk is way more ambitious than what I can deliver today. But what I would like to do is to, first of all, signal the overarching interests that have animated my research, and to bring our conversation about sovereignty and legitimacy, in particular in modern Islamic thought, in the context of these larger concerns. And the first concern really for me is to take Islamic thought out of the ghetto, so to speak. And the ghetto operates in two very important ways. One way in which we think about Islamic thought, and a lot of research has, especially in intellectual history and history of political thought, has operated by actually imagining that Islamic thought is produced when Islamic thinkers or Muslim thinkers speak to other thinkers, other Muslim thinkers, and the genealogy that is built is so exclusively Islamic or Muslim that we often lose the richness of the debates that they have engaged in and the wider kind of context and debates that they have engaged in. Sometimes when in this context we have thought about the engagement that especially modern Islamic thinkers have displayed with European thought, it is often classified as derivative discourse. And I think that really the time has come for us to move beyond that and to think about those wider debates that many Islamic thinkers who were not just Muslim, but actually looking to make Islamic arguments, many of them saw themselves as participating in a much wider debate. And so this I think of as the ghetto of production of Islamic knowledge, so to speak. The other ghetto is the consumption of Islamic knowledge. Who is this knowledge for? And often again, not all scholarship, but a dominant trend in scholarship is to assume that Islamic thought is for Muslims. Islamic thought applies only to Muslims. And of course, the foil here is European theory and European thought. That is seen to be general, universal. Islamic thought is useful either just for Muslims or to understand Muslims. So if it is useful for non-Muslims primarily to understand what's going on in these Muslim polities and Muslim contexts. And so in that sense, I think, my concern about Islamic thought and moving it beyond that ghetto of consumption, so to speak, of knowledge, is very similar to concerns about African American thought, about Native American thought, the way that is ghettoized, or African debates might be ghettoized, as if they are only relevant to the specific people that they, or the specific traditions that they originate from. So my suggestion here is not that we move from European universalism to Islamic universalism. My suggestion here is not for an easy inversion, but actually for a much more detailed, painstaking, thinking through of which ideas, which questions might be useful to think about in more general context, and what solutions from Islamic resources might be very useful for us, again, to address wider questions. And in particular, in my own work, I focused on how Islamic thought and Islamic ideas, questions, solutions from Islamic context might be helpful in questioning liberalism and understanding the limitations of liberalism, which is the dominant ideological framework that we all operate within. So with these concerns in mind, I'm going to provide a glimpse into, in the time that I have, I think what I can do best is probably provide a glimpse into the very influential articulation of the idea of divine sovereignty that was put forward by Abul Ala Maududi. And we all, know Maududi precisely because he articulated ideas that became very influential. But I think that in some ways, Maududi's ideas are influential, not necessarily because of the solutions that he proposed, and those were deeply problematic, but because of the questions he identified and the way he set about going to answer those questions. So Maududi actually brought together a very wide range of ideas, and I'll try and give you a quick sense of those. And then he worked very creatively, actually, both with European theory and also with Islamic thought to rework existing ideas and put them to new uses, to put them to address problems that he thought were important. And we see, sorry, there seems to be a fly, and we see that precisely because those ideas, those questions were important, that his thought has some of the purchase that it continues to have today. So what I argue is that Maududi articulated the most systematic bridge between a concern about the sovereignty of the state and the institutional mechanism of the modern state and Islamic philosophy, or I guess he called it Sharia. So basically, he articulated a very a systematic answer to the question of how do we engage with and manage this new institutional infrastructure, which allows very intensive management of the individual, within pretty much all contexts. So he took ideas about God's hukum, Allah's authority, Allah's legitimacy, Allah's priorness to all law. These were long-standing debates in Islamic thought. Maududi took them and reconceptualized them, reworked them as the idea of divine sovereignty in the political realm. There is obviously much debate about it, and I'm happy to answer questions about this as we go forward. But I think, precisely the fact, as Qasim Zaman has noted, that the broad contours of Maududi's conception of divine sovereignty are actually really influential, not just among Islamists, but actually among Muslim polities around the world. And some of these ideas have become so pervasive that it is useful to go back to Maududi and kind of think about what was the problem that he was trying to solve here. Okay, so the first thing, of course, to note is that when Maududi articulated the idea of hakimiyat in his original Urdu writings, he always provided the English word sovereignty next to it, because he was aware that he is making an argument, he's presenting an idea that requires some translation, that it is not the old version of hakim. This term hakimiyat actually connotes something new. So what is that something new? Now, as I said, Maududi engaged with a range of ideas from European political theory and history. He learned some English. He apparently tried to teach himself German, apparently, to read Marx, but he didn't get very far with that. He did read some Marx, but in fact, he also engaged with Marxist ideas, which were hugely pervasive, very influential through the 1920s onwards in the Indian context. And the Bolshevik Revolution was immensely influential at an intellectual and political context, in the context that Maududi was operating in, precisely because the Bolshevik Revolution showed that the state could be transformed, political structures could be transformed quite radically to bring about societal transformation. And of course, the colonial liberal state was doing that as well. But the Bolshevik Revolution demonstrated it in a much more radical manner. So Maududi had attended meetings by various, sorry, the screen changed and I was a bit confused by that. Okay. So Maududi had attended meetings by Khairi brothers, socialists, and others in India. He also was at one point an admirer of Gandhi, and Gandhi had also raised questions about whether sovereignty was to be expressed through the state. And for Gandhi, the answer was no. For Gandhi, as for Maududi, sovereignty is a question of ethical perfection. Gandhi made the argument that sovereignty could not be achieved through the state, and each individual had to work at attaining sovereignty. You weren't born with sovereignty, you had to work to attain it, but it didn't require the state. Maududi was also influenced by those ideas. So in a period through the 20s into the 1950s, in a period that was thick with debates and ideas about alternatives, utopias, anti-colonial mobilizations of various kinds, Maududi actually, if you look at his writings, but also his life history, he engaged with a lot of these debates. And one of the things that he then, despite his skepticism about the state, one of the things that he, I think, picked up on and tried to work with is the idea that the state can be an important vehicle of ethical perfection, of societal transformation and individual ethical perfection. And this was, of course, an idea. The state was seen as that kind of a vehicle for transformation by the communists, by the fascists, but also by the liberal nationalists and the socialists. Everybody, in a sense, was looking at the state as that vehicle of transformation, societal transformation. So Maududi saw the state, and actually Maududi's primary concern was about the idea of popular sovereignty. He saw popular sovereignty as a kind of an ethical and moral problem. What was that problem? So he thought that the state is the entity with control over coercive power in a territory. But what allows the state this coercive control? Now, Maududi's answer was that actually there's some amount of sleight of hand going on. What that sleight of hand was that the state could use coercive power because people actually thought that they were not enslaved. Why did people think they were not enslaved? They thought that they were not enslaved because the state was an expression of their will. The state was actually representing their will. Now, this deception, he argued, it lies in the deception that is involved here lies in the fact that in theory, hakimiyat or sovereignty belongs to each individual. And I'm, taking this directly from Maududi's text. But he says practically, the democratic state cannot really represent each individual separately, so it tends to represent the majority. Now, how is the majority formed? On what basis is a majority designed and defined? That to Maududi was deeply problematic, and he thought that this was had really grave implications for democracy. So he said it could only work well in contexts where there was fundamental agreement about fundamental concerns, about what he called asasi amur. But this was likely to be true in a very small number of cases in very limited situations. The more likely and prevalent outcome, he thought, was going to be the oppression of the minority by the majority. And, of course, the most developed democracies of his time actually provided him with very good examples. And he wrote in quite a lot of detail about African Americans in America in particular. And this was an important case for him because he could point out that African Americans' rights are protected by the Constitution, yet the social and political marginalization that they face and the violence that they face means that they can't even go to vote. So the majority gets formed in a particular way. He also wrote, obviously, Nazi Germany provided him with examples of how democratically elected governments could marginalize and really carry out various kinds of oppressions on a minority, but also liberal nationalist governments such as UK and the Irish and Catholics in UK. So his concern then was that popular sovereignty could mandate this oppression, mandate racism, legitimize colonialism, legitimize these oppressions. And he made the argument that popular sovereignty did not recognize any moral limits to sovereignty, to state sovereignty. And this is why he thought of popular sovereignty as a moral problem. And he looked towards Sharia to provide that kind of, he made the argument that there are no minimum norms of to restrict oppression, but Sharia, he thought, provided that moral framework where at least the legitimacy to oppression was not present. So he recognized, and I think this is why he's such an interesting thinker, because he also recognizes as he goes along some of the limitations of his own argument. So he recognized that various Islamic empires and states had been oppressive in the past, but he implies that the difference is that there is no legitimization of that oppression, that unlike as the kind of legitimization that popular sovereignty can provide to, say, racism, that kind of legitimization is not possible. So for him, parsing out this conflation of popular and state sovereignty was linked to his attempt at working through the implications of European history for dominant political ideas, while also confronting at the same time the institutional infrastructure of the modern state, which was now, pervasive around the world. And we know, I won't go into this because I think I'm coming towards the end of my time, but
5 minutes.
Thank you. So we know, I won't go into the details, but we know that, sovereignty in the European context, political sovereignty becomes an important concept precisely because the church and the church's control as it wanes, the idea of if it's not divine laws, then what legitimizes state sovereignty, popular sovereignty becomes important here. But actually what we also see is that as ideas of popular sovereignty grow, they also become really enmeshed with ideas about the territorial and cultural specificity of the people who express this popular sovereignty. In other words, popular sovereignty and nationalism develop together in the European context. Now, Maududi is alert to this, and he, again, he has a very detailed and very profound criticism of nationalism as an ideology, and as he thinks of it as a particularly European ideology that he thinks, the rest of the world does not have to follow up on that. But actually many of his Indian and Muslim interlocutors, first of all, he thought that they were mistaken in not recognizing that one idea that actually was beginning to become a real competitor to the idea of deen was the idea of the state. And I'm quoting him here. He says, in its comprehensiveness and demands for sovereignty, and I quote, is the idea of the state, even though it needs more depth to fully take on the meaning of deen. So he thought, first of all, people are not recognizing this in his Indian context, but also more widely around the world. And then because it is so closely linked to nationalism, he thought that in the colonies, the conflation between popular sovereignty and nationalism was leading many anti-colonialists down the wrong route, because they felt that they had to establish their credentials as a nation before they could claim popular sovereignty. And this is the route that many important anti-colonial actors such as Nehru, Nehru went down that path. The liberal nationalist Jinnah took this path, and also Hindu nationalists such as Savarkar, again, assumed that popular representation required nationalism in a sense. So Maududi articulated a critique of both popular sovereignty and nationalism, and this kind of conflation that he thought was a result of European history that others could actually sidestep if they could recognize the conceptual and political problems that were raised by this. And it is, of course, interesting to note that in contemporary political theory, there is still a strand of liberal nationalist political theory, which is trying to precisely work through this argument. And, David Miller or Yael Tamir continue to argue that the idea of nation is necessary for democratic representation. So this is an ongoing tension, and we know politically this is an ongoing tension, because the rise of nationalist populism in India, in UK, in the US is a reality. So in some ways, Maududi, along with others, but certainly Maududi in his own right, is prescient in noting this conflation between popular sovereignty and the idea of the nation. So let me just quickly conclude. The questions that Maududi raised about popular sovereignty, sorry.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. All right, thank you. So the questions that Maududi raised about operationalizing popular sovereignty or democratic theory are ones that not just political theorists, but also ordinary people struggle with in many different contexts. The relationship between popular sovereignty and state sovereignty that he was also concerned with has become more and not less contested over the last century and again. And so again, Maududi's ideas resonate because he was prescient in recognizing these fault lines and noticing the particular challenges they hold as mass democracy becomes the norm. But really, I think the main contribution that Maududi makes is that he went beyond critique. He articulated a solution by creatively reworking ideas from within the Islamic tradition, taking the idea of hukum and reworking it as a notion of political sovereignty. I'm happy to go into this in more detail, but I just want to state that I'm not arguing that his vision of an Islamic state is perfect, or in fact that we should be following it. I think there are foundational flaws in the solution that he proposes. But I think that it is important to think about the way he went about making his argument. And that is where I think part of the power of his ideas and their influence lies, which is that he inverted colonial hierarchies of knowledge, where colonial hierarchies of knowledge posited that European theory was the general and the universal. Maududi inverted it to say Islamic theory can provide solutions for these general problems. And he engaged with a wide range of ideas, but ultimately really drew upon Islamic ideas. But he also didn't see Islamic ideas as necessarily static, which we can see by how he reworked Islamic ideas, right? So he didn't really think that the answers were just lying there. The answers had to be creatively assembled. And so in the process, I think he parochializes European thought, not by outright rejection, although he sometimes used that language, but through an engagement with the differences in experiences, histories, and philosophical assumptions. The militarization of Islamism that really came about during the Cold War and continues with the war on terror, should not, I think, obscure the ambitious intellectual and political project that Maududi undertook and the methodological innovations and theoretical avenues that he opened for us to engage with questions about sovereignty and legitimacy of the modern state that are not, settled yet. But I think he raised interesting questions and provided some interesting methodological avenues for us to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iqtidar, for your presentation. I just want to say I grew up in the late, when I was just growing up, the late 60s, early 70s, when I was in Egypt. The two most influential thinkers on those who were looking at Islam as being merely not just religion, but also it could be the infrastructure for building the Islamic Ummah that were Sayyid Qutb and Mawdudi. And we read Mawdudi and we read Qutb, and now it's interesting to look back half century later, how their thoughts have affected not only the Muslim world, but also individual Muslims and movements and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to give you a series of questions. Perhaps when we come to the question and answer, you can address them.
Sure.
To me, it looks like Mawdudi was trying to reconcile much of what he thought was modern political thought with Islam. And I would like you to run, quickly, where do you think we can say that he saw it as being correctly projected, and where he made some errors. You talked about the question of popular sovereignty and hakimiyya, or God's sovereignty, and that by itself is rejected in secular or liberal democracy. And it's interesting to see how he looked at democracy being practiced. Is it just some segments of democracy, or what they termed as shura? Also, where do you think his impact has been, particularly when we look at Jamaat Islami in Pakistan and what it accomplished or didn't accomplish, where this thought actually made a greater impact or influence within the body politics of Pakistan, or for that matter, the Indian subcontinent as a whole. And then the question of legitimacy. I think much of today's political thought runs around the liberal democracy or liberal democratic values, representation, elections, and so on and so forth. And I'm not sure this is how he saw it, but I'd like to see how you think he saw the question of legitimacy. And finally, the question of the nation state. Certainly, people like Al-Mawdudi and Hassan al-Banna, even though they spoke in general terms, they have accepted the notion of a nation state and to work within the concept of a nation state. Now, again, half a century later, should have they been more forceful, pushing against the nation state, and how it became the most powerful political ideology, not just in the West and Europe where it started, but also throughout the Muslim world today? Or was this a correct way of progression? The way Hassan al-Banna saw it, that he starts with Egypt and then the Arab world and then beyond and beyond. But actually, they never went beyond Egypt, not just on the political level, but also ideologically. You will see more and more nationalist ideas being part of the Islamic movement, so profess to be more of an ummatic version. So these are some of the questions. I have many others, but we can start with these. But next we have Professor Khaled Abou Fadl, who will address us on the topic of religion and politics, what history reveals about tyranny and despotism. And in that presentation, he will focus on some of these thoughts that were developed most recently after the Arab Spring, particularly in Saudi Arabia, the Madkhali school and the Jami school. Dr. Khaled Abou Fadl, we're very pleased to have you. Your time, 22 minutes.
I'm very honored to be with you.
You need to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, please.
Still you can't hear?
Yes, I think we can hear you.
Can you hear?
Him?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Well, okay. I can't hear you, but speak. Maybe we can.
Grace is telling me that
Grace?
that's unmuted. Grace? It's unmuted, right?
It is. It's fine. Can you hear?
Can you? I think. Can you hear?
Okay.
Okay. Select English. Okay.
Can you hear now?
Grace, can you say something?
Is that okay?
Yeah,
I can hear you now. Okay, he can start.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Sorry about that. I'm not very literate in computers. Actually, I'm not literate at all. So other than typing, that's the only thing I can do is computers.
That's all what we need from you. That's
So,
right.
I'm honored to be with you. I think these conferences are essential, and they're essential to bring the scholars, not just scholars, but to connect the Muslim Ummah in a cooperative project. Okay, first, so I want to start out by noting the limitation of our discourse about Islamic political thought and history, because the fact of the matter is that we have not done the hard work of unpacking actual real developments in Islamic history or understanding Islamic history beyond the Eurocentric narrative of Islamic history. The narrative which basically posits an ideal Khilafa Rashida that quickly disintegrates into mulk, and then the famous claim by European historians about the so-called Islamic compromise from the ideal Khilafah to a pragmatic acceptance of absolutism and despotism in the ideas of Maududi and Abu Ya'la and so on. I have very serious doubts that that narrative of Islamic history is actually historical beyond what is has been narrated by people like Montgomery Watts and Gibbs and Rosenthal and Goldziher and so on and so forth. The part of the problem is that the narrative which tells us that democracy in the sense of a representative system of government existed as an ideal in early Greek thought, and that then it is lost to humanity and then reclaimed during the European Reformation, is just that. It's a mythology. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, inshallah, is really about mythologies of history, and particularly the way particular Islamic movements understand this mythology. It was always in Islamic moral thought and Sharia discourses, the idea of shura as a loose form of consultation in which people's will is represented by, in some form or another, was always present as a moral ideal. But it is important to keep in mind that what we call today democracy, with all its institutional and procedural structures, it was a very complicated matter in Islamic history. What Muslim scholars often rested with, or what they often resorted to, was a very vague idea of shawka. Shawka, the power of those who hold power to represent, or the ability of those who hold power to represent in some form or another the consent of the governed. Now, how that consent is obtained is where you get very complicated historical questions. Whether that consent is mixed in with traditional institutional power structures, whether it's mixed in with brute power, the simple threat of force, whether it is the existence of some form of rule of law or some form of order and stability, the ideal remained that under best of conditions, is that the shawka would represent something more meaningful than ikrah, than simple compulsion and simple coercion. And that ideally, that in istibdad bil-ra'i, or despotism, forms of decision making that did not incorporate shura or consultation was reprehensible, if not haram, at least makruh. But Muslim, beyond that, we really need to re-examine Islamic historical political thought without the Eurocentric narratives that have dominated so much of the scholarship and that still dominates so much of the Muslim imagination about their own history. It is very common to hear Muslim intellectuals and scholars, especially after the Arab Spring, say something like, well, democracy, Muslims have never known a democracy, and the entire Islamic history has been simply despotic. Therefore, repeating and affirming and legitimating the idea of Oriental despotism as something that is a pronounced characteristic of Islamic history. While in reality, if we historicize that question, I don't think it would easily lend itself to the ideological uses that which it's put in our modern day. So this is an important backdrop before moving on to some of the main concerns and the things that I want to, because of the interest of time, I want to flag as worthy of serious consideration and talk. There was one Islamic movement among all the Islamic movements that existed in the 19th century and the early 20th century that was not anti-colonial. While Hassan al-Banna, people like Hassan al-Banna, people like Maududi, people like Afghani, people like Muhammad Abdu, people like Rashid Rida, colonialism and a response to colonialism was always present in their mind and present in their work. There's one Islamic movement that never concerned itself with a response to colonialism. And obviously, I think it is obvious that I'm talking about the Wahhabi movement, which eventually comes to dominate the Hijaz and to become the de facto representative of Mecca and Medina. Wahhabiyya, while puritanical, utopian in many ways, was never concerned with colonialism. Rather, it adhered to a mythology that, a historical mythology, that Muslims beyond the Khilafah al-Rashida have the early Khilafah of the four rightly guided caliphs have gone astray, and that Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah effectively disappear beyond the Khilafah al-Rashida, and that there's a long trajectory of Islamic disintegration and corruption that only witnesses a revisionist reform with the birth of the Wahhabi movement. So we notice that Wahhabism, while it has nothing to say about colonialism, had a great deal to say about how the Muslim Ummah has gone astray at the moment of the birth of Wahhabism, and that how Wahhabism restores the Muslim Ummah to its original theology of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is fascinating because anyone that has been raised in the Arab world would have learned the history, a mythology largely, that Mecca and Medina were full of deviation and bid'ah and ahwa. And in fact, part of these bid'ah and ahwa was the Ottoman Khilafah itself in Mecca and Medina, and that Wahhabism came to restore Islam to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah by fighting and resisting all these bid'ah and ahwa, all these innovations, and bringing back Islam to the core theology of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. However, Wahhabism relies on a utopian idea and a puritanical idea that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is not represented by sociological or anthropological complexities. It is rather represented in a textual embodiment. That the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah is represented in the text of the Quran and the Hadith, and that somehow the Quran and Hadith then become translated into a sociological reality that is linear, non-complex, non-pluralistic, not nuanced. And that was quite core to the ideas of Wahhabi Islam. And it will become obvious why I'm choosing to focus on this in particular. The similarities, I think, while there are overlaps between Wahhabi ideas and other Salafi ideas like the ideas of Rashid Rida and Maududi, but the remarkable lack of interest in the colonial moment that we find in Wahhabism is what makes Wahhabism quite distinctive. Wahhabism was always interested in the bid'ah of the Shia, bid'ah al-Sufiyya, bid'ah al-Aqlaniyya, all the forms of what they identified, in other words, all the forms of what they saw as deviations within Islam, but was oddly complacent and silent towards external powers. And I'll tie this in 1 second, how at least I see the development of Wahhabism on this point. External powers, rather leaving the entire relationship of what to do about external powers and colonial powers to Sahib al-Sulta, to the Imam, whoever that Imam is. Whatever the Imam says goes, while aqidat al-wala wal-bara meant that you should morally, ethically distance yourself from non-Muslims, but how you dealt with the power of non-Muslims, colonial powers included, was simply left to the Imam or to Sahib al-Sulta, Sahib al-Shawka, that person who holds power, regardless of how they manage to hold power. Okay. Now, there's one other aspect that is very important about the idea of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah in Wahhabi thought. And that is Wahhabism, from its inception, imagined Islam as primarily, predominantly, an Arab religion. There is very little in Wahhabism for the sociological realities or anthropological complexities of non-Arab societies. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah can be transported or transplanted from the text to the Arab experience, particularly in Arabia, and then that Arab experience in Arabia can be then exported as a theology of Puritanism, theology of correct belief and practice to the rest of the Muslim world, as if non-Arabs have nothing to contribute to the reality of Islam. This comes, and in the interest of time, because the things that I want to flag the most, de facto politics it's a remarkably politics is left to whoever is assumed to hold the shawka, and whoever is assumed to hold the shawka, as long as they have coercive power, not the rule of law, but simply coercive power, not anything more lofty than coercive power, that person, that central authority, is left the entire discretion, or is left with the entire discretion of dealing with the entire outside world, and their word is law. In early manifestations of Wahhabism, in theory, if that holder of power orders something that is against the Quran and Sunnah, then they are not owed obedience. But in reality, the Wahhabi theology went in great lengths to rely on the juristic discourses on darura and masalih amma and dar' al-mafasid to effectively say, even if the ruler orders something that appears to be against the Quran and Sunnah, what proper Muslims who belong to Ahl Sunnah and Jama'ah should do is to persevere with sabr, to have patience, and not to rebel, and not to disobey, and in fact relying very heavily on what is cited in Wahhabi literature throughout the famous hadith that is attributed to the Prophet, that you should obey a ruler even if they are a black slave from Ethiopia, etc., even if the ruler flogs you or beats you or robs your money, you owe this ruler nothing but obedience. There was a mediation and a complex process of negotiation between Wahhabi Salafi ideas and Ikhwani, Maududi type ideas, Ikhwani type ideas, Sururi type ideas, that for a period of time gave the impression that Wahhabism can in fact produce something not more nuanced than a stark reliance on coercive power. However, after the Arab Spring, it becomes quite clear, and I want to focus in my remaining time on these, perhaps we can pick up in discussions.
Dr. Khaled, 5 minutes.
In the meanwhile, you have the ideas of people like Muhammad Aman al-Jami al-Habashi and Rabi' Abdul Hadi al-Madkhali, who introduced something that is quite fascinating. Any deviation or any social, sociological, and anthropological complexity was deemed a form of bid'iyya, ahkam bid'iyya, or firaq ahwa'iyya, sometimes called Jarrahin or Manahij al-Khuluf, or sometimes referred to as Salafiyya al-Wafida, in different forms. But the basic idea is that the ruler must be assumed to be endowed with the legitimate representation of Ahl Sunnah and Jama'ah, and that any attempt to correct the ruler or to present any type of more nuanced image beyond what the picture that the ruler offers is by definition illegitimate. So in Madkhali and Jami Islam, we often see that al-Islam la yara munafasat sahab al-sulta, that whoever is in power cannot be competed with, that the worst danger on Islam is not al-istibdad, but al-tamarrud al-siyasi, is not despotism, but dissent within a polity. But here's what I want to flag, perhaps in closing, and I hope we can pick this up in discussion. What Madkhali and Jami Islam ended up not just legitimating a theology of despotism, not just insisting on the Arabization of Islam and a set of mythologies about Arab history and Islamic history, but the nature of the theology of Shawka itself shifted. Shawka became no longer what the Muslim ruler is able to, what the Muslim ruler offers in terms of coercive power. But Shawka became what the world order has in terms of coercive power. So it became quite common in Madkhali and Jami Islam to say that the ruler can legitimately not rebel against non-Muslim power because non-Muslims are Ashab Shawka, are the holders of legitimate power in the world. And when the ruler then told us that obedience is owed to non-Muslims, possessors of power, that becomes in turn the will of God. Madkhali and Jami Islam not just philosophize despotism and absolutism, but have made entire society linear and flat, where it is the stark power of non-Muslims that have hegemony in the world becomes the legitimate will of God, and then the hegemony within Muslim lands, which is subservient to the hegemony of non-Muslims, becomes in turn the will of God, and any attempt to challenge, negotiate, even seriously think about that hegemonic structures of power becomes a sin and a rebellion against the will of God. And this is why Madkhali and Jami Islam describes any attempt to think in critical terms about hegemonic structures of power by whether they attribute that to the Ikhwani movement, which is commonly what they do, or to the Sururi movement, or to the Maududi movement. All of that is described as ifsad fil ard, as corruption on earth, and istatabu al ahwa, and innovation. It is a remarkable legitimation of colonial reality and hegemonic structures of power that obviously serve very convenient political and economic ends in the world that we live in today. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled, for this presentation. I would like to ask you, of course, a few questions and also to elaborate on some of the ideas you presented. When we look at the Islamic history in terms of the question of tyranny versus chaos, you referred to it, some of the Islamic scholars have said that 1,000 days of tyranny, or 1,000 years rather of tyranny, is better than 1 day of chaos. How do you put it in today's word? I mean, certainly the suffering that takes place today in much of the Muslim world, we've seen it particularly after the Arab Spring movements, things that are happening today, and the chaos that has been basically pushed by the counter-revolutionary forces in order to present to the Arab masses and to Muslim masses in general, that if you get into the business of trying to change the government through revolutions and uprisings and rejection and to call for popular democracy, this is where you're going to end up having civil wars and all kinds of miseries that are imposed on them. So how do you assess this situation? And certainly those who are advocating the Madkhali and the Jami type of thoughts are trying to propagate this. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this, and also the questions of legitimacy. How do you see legitimacy Certainly, we're going to speak in this conference about the experiment taking place now in Tunisia and other places. Is that the form of legitimacy? Do you think people should be advocating, or should we be critical, because democracy is not going to resolve and solve these critical questions that we have today? A liberal democracy certainly has its own problems, and tomorrow we will discuss some of these problems. So particularly, I wanted to answer the questions of legitimacy, the questions of revolution, and the question of the role of the Muslim scholars to stand up to these kind of thoughts by al-Madkhali and Jami. But our third speaker, before we get into discussion, is Dr. Mahmoud Mamdani. Thank you, Dr. Mamdani, for joining us. And he will be speaking to us, again, not only from his intellectual endeavor in this, but also he did live in Africa. He's originally from Africa, and he was in South Africa. And his presentation, which I'm looking forward to hear, is about dismantling apartheid, what we could learn from the South African transition of 1994. Dr. Mamdani.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to thank the first speaker for setting in motion a train of thought which legitimizes my presentation, which is that we must break out of the ghetto. And I think what it means to break out of the ghetto is to take our very particular experiences and try and theorize them, try and reflect on how they remain not only contextually relevant, but how they can be translated and transported from one context, one historical context, to another. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to offer this presentation. I have a couple of questions just at the outset. When I read the invitation, I wondered, what do we mean by the Muslim world? Is the Muslim world any different from the world we live in? Is it only that part of the world where Muslims are a numerical majority? Or does it also include the part where we Muslims are in a minority? I'm from Uganda, where Muslims are a minority. My ancestors came from India to East Africa. Muslims are a minority in both places. And I'm going to talk about South Africa. And there too, Muslims are a minority. I think quite often we have an underlying assumption in our discussion of Muslim thought, which presumes a Muslim majority society. I think we need to broaden that, to think of different contexts. And I would even say contexts which are becoming increasingly preponderant. Now, South African, I want to suggest that if we break out of the ghetto and think of South Africa in broader terms, the South African experience offers a number of lessons. First of all, I think it challenges us to think of the nation state as a historical phenomenon. It challenges us to break out of the mold of nation state thinking. Secondly, I think it also invites us to think of majority and minority as artifacts of the state. Thirdly, it invites us to distinguish political from cultural identity, to decouple culture and politics, and finally, to think of political identity as historical. Now, what I'm going to offer to you is really drawn from my latest book, which is called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. It's just published by Harvard University Press 2-3 weeks ago. I went to South Africa in 1994, then 1996. I had a professorship at University of Cape Town. And in my inaugural lecture at UCT, University of Cape Town, I organized this around a single question. When does a settler become a native? The answer I offered then, and I still believe to be true, is never. The settler can never become a native, because the native is a creation of the settler state. The native is the settler's invented other. The settler claimed to be not only the product of history, but also its maker, at the same time stigmatizing the native as a product of geography, and thus an unthinking captive of an unchanging custom. And I would expand the notion of custom, because we've had two different kind of discourses, one on custom and the other on Sharia. And they should both be seen as components of a single discourse. The claim that there is something called customary which does not change historically over time. And this has been an imperial claim. I argued that settler and native are joined, neither can exist in isolation. Should you destroy the settler, you will also destroy the native. What defined settlers and natives was not the color of their skin, but the law under which each was governed. Settlers and natives were governed under separate laws. Settlers under civil law and natives under customary law. Civil law changed with history. In contrast, customary law was said to be as unchanging as geography. If civil law was created by the settler, customary law was sanctioned by the settler, purged of everything the settler considered repugnant to civilization. Both civil and customary law bore the imprint of the settler. This system, whereby settlers and natives are governed under separate laws, is known as indirect rule. I'd like to briefly outline the history of indirect rule before I return to the South African story. By the way, when I go over my allotted time, just cut me off.
I give you a warning, 5
yeah.
minutes and 2 minutes.
Yeah, and if I am unable to stick to the warning, just cut me off, okay? Thank you. There are three main phases in the development of indirect rule: Roman, Ottoman, and British. The three stages correspond to three different forms of indirect rule: individual, institutional, and territorial. Let me elaborate. Individual indirect rule is associated with the Romans. They governed their less organized Western Empire directly through armed settlements of soldiers, but in the more organized Eastern Empire in Asia and Africa, Roman rule was indirect and individual, through local potentates such as Cleopatra of Egypt, Herod of Judea, who were required to pay tribute to Roman overlords. The Ottoman millet system is the prime example of institutional indirect rule. In this system, subject groups in the empire were governed through their own leadership and their own customs, both being subordinate to the Ottoman state. The millet was more of a culturally than a territorially defined group. Thus, an Armenian in Istanbul and an Armenian in Eastern Anatolia were said to be members of the same millet and subject to its authority. The Mughal practice of governing through local religious institutions and traditions is yet another example of institutional indirect rule. The point of ruling different groups through their own customary law was to keep them separate, even if they were under the same power. It also had the virtue of claiming that nothing had changed, since the subjects were being ruled under their own traditional law. Even if the colonized were a majority, they were fragmented into a set of culturally defined minorities. The British used all three forms of indirect rule: individual, institutional, and territorial. In the early period of the empire in India, the British struck deals with rulers of princely states, as had the Romans with potentates in the Eastern Empire. Outside the princely states, the British turned to institutional indirect rule. governing through customary law and religious authority, mainly by the 1830s. The difference with the Mughals was that custom became customary law, that being the origin of Anglo-Mohammedan and Hindu law in the British Empire. The third form of indirect rule was territorial. Its practice was mainly in the Indian reservations in North America and the British colonies in Africa. The main feature of territorial indirect rule was that it anchored each ethnic group to a territory, a homeland. It thereby politicized ethnic identity. It is when ethnic identity was territorialized and politicized that it became a modern tribe. Territorial indirect rule was introduced in a very rudimentary form by the British in Ireland, but its modern form was really a North American innovation around which was formed the Indian reservation. First tested in the mid-19th century in California, the reservation was made a comprehensive institution through which Indians were governed. First, really an institution generalized by Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant. The reservation segregated Indians from whites, stripped Indians of land, and minimized the political threat they posed by subjecting them to domination under colonially supervised customary law. Settlers in the US got state independence from Britain in 1776. In South Africa, state independence came in 1910. Soon after, a South African state delegation visited North America, USA and Canada. Its object was to study the North American way of containing Indians. The delegation studied the reservation system in North America, brought back a blueprint, including the language of governance. In the process, the North American reservation became the South African Reserve. The reserve was based on a three-part institutional blueprint borrowed from the Indian reservation. One, every native must belong to a homeland. The idea was to take a part of where people had lived at the time of their colonization and declare this part, and only this part, a traditional homeland, and charge the native authority with responsibility to confine the tribe to this so-called customary homeland. Two, the tribal homeland was governed through a customary law which distinguished between Indians who belonged to the tribe and those who did not. Only those part of the tribe were accorded rights in the reservation. Three, the customary law in the tribal homeland was governed by an authority said to be customary. This customary authority was accountable to the settler state, not to the population of the homeland. The system survives today. In the US today, for example, reservation Indians are considered wards of the US Congress. They do not enjoy the protection of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. They have no enforceable rights. Indians were excluded from protections given citizens by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A special act was passed for Indians, the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, whose provisions are merely advisory to the reservation authority. I studied the development of apartheid in a book I wrote earlier called Citizen and Subject. Now, in whatever time I've left, I want to focus on the struggle against apartheid.
You have
Apartheid,
9 minutes.
5 minutes.
Nine minutes.
Oh, well, I was pessimistic. Okay, thank you. Apartheid governance fractured the South African political community along two lines, race and tribe. The key political challenge of decolonization was how to depoliticize race and tribe to create a single political community. The first phase of the struggle against apartheid reproduced the racial political architecture of apartheid. Apartheid had divided the whole population into four so-called population groups: Africans, Indians, coloreds, and whites. In response, each population group organized as a separate race. Africans as the African National Congress, Indians as the Natal Indian Congress of Gandhi, coloreds as the Colored People's Congress, and whites, because they couldn't call themselves Congress of Whites, they called themselves Congress of Democrats. Ironically, the subjects of apartheid reproduced politically the very identities enforced on them by apartheid, race. Theirs were so many derivative political identities. These racially demarcated resistant groups sometimes worked together under the aegis of the Congress Alliance, whose high point was the ringing declaration of 1955, known as the Freedom Charter. Quote, South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. But this declaration was made by elites who mostly segregated themselves. Decades would pass before they formally joined under one organizational structure. It was, for example, only in 1987 that the ANC admitted Indians and Khaleds into its National Executive Committee. I trace the second phase of the anti-apartheid struggle to the strike movement of the 1970s, not to the armed struggle or exile politics, nor to the international boycott movement. The force behind the strike movement of the 1970s were student activists of all colors who organized migrants and township labor. The 1970s worker strikes were led by students. Together, students and workers crafted a vision that exploded the narrow confines into which each had been slotted by the architects of apartheid. Together, they moved the locus of struggle from exiled professional revolutionaries and imprisoned fighters to popular strata in South African communities. They brought the struggle home. They also replaced an aborted guerrilla movement with non-violent agitation to enormous effect. By acting peacefully, they maintained the moral high ground and distinguished themselves from an obviously violent system of oppression. Although they did not end apartheid on their own, they created the social and political paralysis that forced South Africa's white rulers to capitulate in 1990 open negotiations. The student and worker uprising marked a shift not only in South Africa, but in the whole paradigm of liberation struggle, preceding the intifada that shook occupied Palestine in the 1980s and Eastern Europe's largely nonviolent revolutions of that same decade. Student initiatives were instrumental in breaking down color lines. Joint student action began when non-white students joined the liberal wing of the white student movement, NUSAS, looking for an effective channel of organization. But soon, chafed at the paternalism and hegemony of white organizers, Steve Biko and his comrades struck out on their own. They founded the South African Students' Organization, a group open only to Blacks, and pledged to enhance what they call Black consciousness. But by Blacks, Biko and others promoting Black consciousness meant African, Indian, and colored students. Black consciousness was a historic rupture with the mindset of apartheid. Black, Biko argued, is not a color. If you are oppressed, you are Black. The departure of Black youth from white organizations created a crisis for progressive whites. Unlike Black students who returned to townships to organize community-based protest, white students found themselves in a wilderness. Like prophets outcast, they searched for a constituency and found it in migrant worker hostels on the fringes of townships. Radical white students played a catalytic role in the development of independent unions that began the avalanche which eventually brought down apartheid. The strike wave of 1973-74 was unstoppable, reaching industrial complexes, first in Natal, then Eastern Cape, then Western Cape, and then the Vaal Triangle. Like a magnet, the strike movement attracted hitherto dispersed migrant workers, African, colored, and Indian, into a collective effort that eventually took the form of independent unions. On the heels of the strike wave of 1974-75 followed the Soweto uprising of 1976. Why did the apartheid regime begin looking for a negotiating partner in 1992? One was the rising wave of popular mobilization that was still relatively decentralized and thus presented a centralized power with opportunities for manipulation. Second, radical white activists had challenged apartheid's claim that there could be no white security without a white monopoly of power. Indeed, they suggested the reverse, that whites could be more secure if they gave up their monopoly and the strife it caused. The second development that led white power to look for an alternative mode of governance was the realization that if it continued losing the support of white intelligentsia, this was likely to erode its own white support base. This was the background to discussions between official representatives and Nelson Mandela on the twin issues of majority rule and minority rights. The end of one period was the beginning of another, that of negotiations. But when negotiations began in May, they sidestepped the organizational architecture of the uprising. Like the colonial authorities who allied with customary authorities at the onset of indirect rule, the South African government turned to partners said to be the legitimate leaders of Black South Africa, even though they were marginal to the internal anti-apartheid movement that had actually forced the change that was now afoot. This time, the negotiating partner was the ANC in exile and one of its jailed leaders, Nelson Mandela. Unlike Nelson, who had been in jail for the entire duration of the urban uprising, Winnie Mandela was very much a product of that uprising, adopting its daring and confrontational attitude. Nelson and ANC were no longer at the cutting edge of the political struggle. Indeed, their methods, armed struggle, had been repudiated. Their legitimacy came less from their leadership than from international approval and Nelson Mandela's celebrity as a political prisoner.
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so it's time to make a jump. The anti-apartheid forces responded to apartheid by imagining a new political community in which enemies became adversaries. Their response to extreme violence defied the logic of Nuremberg, the logic of separating perpetrators from victims, punishing perpetrators, and creating separate spheres in which the two could live without harming each other in an ongoing cycle of violence. By thinking of extreme violence as political rather than criminal, South Africans were able to shift focus from individual transgressions of law to the issues that drove the violence and thus the needs of the people who survived it. Instead of going to court, they sat around a conference table rather than turn to a trial to produce truth and punish offenders. They negotiated reforms to make the political system more inclusive. Recognizing that perpetrators as well as beneficiaries and supporters had to be brought into the political process. The South African outcome was different from that in Europe and Nuremberg. The creation of a new political system did not happen in Europe after the defeat of Nazism in World War II. Victims and perpetrators were separated by means of ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe and the establishment of the State of Israel outside of Europe. The post-conflict German state was built by outsiders, while the internal resistance to the Nazis was denied participation. Those forcibly identified by the apartheid state did not go their separate ways to form separate political communities. Instead, they joined together to form a single political union. Why was the South African outcome different from that in Europe? What lessons can the world learn from the South African journey? First, that every political identity is historical, not permanent. Activists overcame differences of race imposed on them to join in a single cause of breaking down apartheid. Second, they came to acknowledge that neither perpetrator nor victim is a permanent identity. Afrikaners, once champions of apartheid, became part of the movement against it. These groups had been formed under colonialism as distinct and often rivalrous, their interests said to be naturally divergent. In response to apartheid, these people learned to think anew their political relation to each other, not as others or as rivals, but as equals in law. They came to recognize that the racial political identities of the past were not timeless, but rather created by political processes. As such, they could be dismantled by political processes as well. Third, the South African struggle teaches us that the main task of political decolonization, even more important than securing independence from external domination, is to reform the internal political community recast by colonial power. Settler domination had rested on two pillars: race and tribe. South Africans felt one pillar of the settler versus native distinction in their country, race as political identity. The other pillar, tribe, persists in the architecture of the South African state. In South Africa, tribe has been naturalized, presumed to be part of a timeless native culture, understood as a historical manifestation of African culture. In the former Bantustans, the regime of customary law remains substantially unreformed, treating Black people based on their tribal identification. Should they live in the wrong tribal homeland, Africans are still denied rights under the customary regime. You may have heard of xenophobic violence. It is worth keeping in mind that this violence is not directed at white persons, but at Black persons. Its targets are not racial strangers, but tribal strangers. South Africa's story tells us much about how a society can go about decolonizing, but it also speaks to the enormous challenge of that worthy project. I think I better stop here.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mahmoud. And I want to thank our three distinguished panelists for their thought-provoking presentations. Before I turn to Dr. Humeira, I want to give Dr. Mamdani also a series of questions to think about when I come back to him. I was struck first by your first comment about the Muslim word, whether they're actually a Muslim word, and it reminded me of Jamil Aydin's book, in which he tries to argue that the Muslim word is an invention both of colonialism and of Islamic movements, which struck a lot other people. While I can also recall the notion in Al-Faruqi, the notion of the ummatic concept, and I wanted to get your perspective on what do you think the meaning of an ummah is? Is it just a Quranic term? Does it have any political implications? Also, the other questions I'd like to ask you is, since we're looking at a global movement for justice when it comes to some of the injustices taking place around the world, do you see Islam playing a meaningful role? And by Islam, I don't just mean the spiritual aspect, but also more like a political or practical aspect. And the third point I'd like you to address, if possible, do you think, even though you come from a minority, when it comes to your country of birth, you do belong to a faith that many people think that it deserves to apply what it believes in their daily lives, while someone like Wa'il Hallaq called it for today the impossible state. Do you think is it reconcilable, having a modern state with a nation state with the rule of Islam in public? Perhaps even some of our distinguished panelists can address that as well. The last point I'd like you to address, if possible, in the context of decolonization, is what do you think the role, particularly after we saw what happened in the Arab Spring and the different counter-revolutionary forces allied with some colonial and imperialist powers trying to suppress this expression of the masses in trying to chart their own course, which I think is part of also decolonization, both at the political as well as cleansing the cultural impact. What do you think? How do you think, when we talk about in the context of South Africa, how that particular movement could turn around and defeat these counter-revolutionary forces, trying to suppress them based on some of the notions you discussed? So let me now go back to Dr. Humeira. I gave you some questions. I hope you still remember them. But add to that also a question from Dr. Hafsa Kanjubal, in which she says one of the oft-repeated claims about Islamic thinkers is that they are very much modern in terms of their thinking. But your analysis of Maududi sort of suggests a critique of modernity and perhaps reliance on pre-colonial understandings of sovereignty. Her question is, has the modern in terms of Islamic thought been overstated? So the floor is yours. You got, hopefully within 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So you asked some very good questions and very profound questions. I'm not sure if I can answer all of them, but let me pick on a few strands. So the first question that you asked was about the relationship between modern political political thought and Islamic thought, and how Maududi and whether he tries to reconcile. And actually, Dr. Kanjwal's question is also somewhat linked. So the first thing to say is that I think it is part of the Orientalist gaze to some extent to continue to strive with this question about the relationship between Islamist thought and modernity. Because as I see it, Islamist thought is modern, not only because the structures, the institutions that they engage with are modern institutions, but actually a critique of modernity does not actually make you anti or pre-modern. The Frankfurt School of Critics, have a very profound critique of modernity. Foucault has a very profound critique of modernity. We don't say that we don't say that they are then outside the pale of modernity because they are critiquing modernity. Similarly, and we don't really place that burden of reconciling their ideas or of reframing those ideas as modern ideas. Similarly, actually, much contemporary democratic theory, even now, keeps going back to pre-modern sources. So we, in European political theory, and I, for my sins, have to attend many of these conferences, we keep going back to Plato and Aristotle. So the resources that we draw in for contemporary political theorizing, say around democracy, etc., many of those resources are pre-modern. Yet, this question is only posed for Islamic thought or for Islamists, because yes, they are going back to an older tradition, but they are also addressing contemporary questions and debates. So I think, for me, Maududi is very much a modern thinker. There are problems with modernity that he identifies, that others have identified, and just being modern by itself is not necessarily, good. I mean, there's the normative association with modernity we can take away. So I think he is a very interesting and challenging thinker. It took me a long time to really get through the depth of his ideas and appreciate the richness of his ideas, because I struggled so much with my own kind of biases coming to Maududi. But I realize also the value of many of the questions that he raised. The other question I think that I can quickly perhaps address is the question of Jamaat Islami in Pakistan. And this is an interesting question because, of course, ideas have a role to play in politics, but they are not, politics is not entirely determined by ideas, and ideas are not entirely determined by material structures. So there is a complex relationship between the two. Jamaat Islami, in some ways, is the most democratic party in Pakistan today. So let me explain how. It is most democratic internally, in the sense that actually it's not dynastic. It has had Amir has changed over its, once Maududi died. Maududi wasn't particularly democratic in this role, but once he died, the party has been pretty democratic in terms of electing the Amir, and the Amirs have come from different classes, different provinces, different ethnic backgrounds. The Jamaat Islami has also been participating in elections since the 1950s, not because it has been successful, but what is interesting is that despite a lack of success, it continues to engage with the electoral process. Now, the Jamaat Islami did also use a lot of violence, particularly through the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, when the Jamaat Islami became a kind of a bulwark against the left influence in Pakistani universities and cultural affairs in particular. And then under General Zia's regime, the Jamaat Islami was a willing partner initially, and then later on, there was a divide within Jamaat Islami and with General Ziaul Haq. So the trajectory is complex, not linear, but on the whole, I think Jamaat Islami has actually been a vehicle of some amount of increasing democratic participation in Pakistan, particularly. In the late 1990s, Jamaat Islami was at the forefront of organizing anti-globalization protests And that's in fact one I first, in a sense, started looking at the Jamaat-e-Islami to think about what really is going on with this party, changing its position. And my first work, in fact, started when I realized that I was carrying out research with labor unions, and I realized that the labor unions, the existing labor unions in Pakistan, had a very big overlap with the Jamaat-e-Islami. And that's my first book actually looks at that dynamic and that relationship between Jamaat-e-Islami and larger kind of long-term effect on predominantly Muslim societies. So I'll stop there, but I also quickly had questions for both the other presenters. For Professor Al-Fadl, this was a really helpful presentation. And one of the things so I guess the first thing was to actually perhaps press you to make a sharper argument. If I understand correctly, is your argument that Wahhabism in a sense represents the Oriental despot? It is perhaps a better representation of the Oriental despot theory that Orientalists had propounded, but at the same time, the Wahhabi movement actually took place in a particular institutional framework, or it really grew in late 19th century onwards in a particular institutional framework where the protection from colonial, from European colonial masters, in a sense, was part of the institutional arrangement that allowed Wahhabism to flourish. So is your argument that Wahhabism is actually, or the Wahhabi movement is actually a prototype for the Oriental despot that earlier Orientalists had written about, but of course the movement is perhaps a bit later than that. And Professor Mamdani, so I really appreciate the idea of actually, in a sense, opening up the idea of the Muslim as going beyond, like Steve Biko's idea about Black being a political identity. Similarly, Muslim potentially being a political identity that identifies with particular positions and particular positions in political arrangements. But I was curious, actually, solidarities are actually quite difficult to construct. And I was curious, so one of the things that I wanted to learn from the South African example that you spoke about, and it's been very useful, how did the 1970s strike movement build these strong coalitions that allowed them to stay nonviolent in the face of extreme state violence, and at the same time reach out in this way? So in a sense, the question is really, how does one carry out this kind of mobilization? And also, how does one then link that to the idea of being a Muslim, being a political identity in a sense, rather than a religious identity?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Humeira. And I'll come back to you in your final thoughts with one more question. But now we turn to Dr. Abou Fadl. In addition to the questions presented to you, I have one more from one of our listeners. Currently, our understanding of Islamic political thought, especially theories of political authority, emerge from a particular genealogy of thinkers from Afghani to Ghanouchi. These actors have been labeled as Islamists. What is the relationship from an Usuli perspective of these political thinkers with the Wahhabism on the one hand and the classical Sunni schools such as Ash'arism? Are Islamic thinkers Sunni? Are they able to speak for Sunnism? Dr. Abou Fadl, if we can do it in about 5 minutes.
It's going to be a challenge. But okay, I'll try.
We're going to extend a few minutes because we started a bit late. So we're going to probably go over 10 minutes, but take your time, 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, I mean, because we have a number of really important issues about the tyranny, the chaos, and the idea of legitimacy. But maybe perhaps I should start very quickly with the question that Professor Iqtidar raised. Um, I think it's quite noteworthy, the very interesting alliance that has emerged even today between Jami and Madkhali expressions of Wahhabism, and interestingly enough, Islamophobic movements. It wasn't that long ago, for instance, when Marine Le Pen's party in France was having all these financial difficulty to be bailed out by the United Arab Emirates. And oddly, in the literature of Madkhali and Jami Islamists, there is very little negative said about Trump or Marine Le Pen, or and in fact, there is the idea of Muslim minorities is dismissed as a corruption of Islamism itself. So it is clear in the literature of Madkhali and Jami Muslims that it is entirely acceptable in their minds that that Muslim minorities be excluded as a corruption of history. That if you're a real Muslim, you would go back to the heart of the Sunnah and Jama'ah, in the heart of the Muslim world, however they define it, which is mostly the Gulf area, the Arabia. I think that's very interesting because it's not a coincidence that the celebration of tyranny as naturally Islamic and despotism as the natural state of order, and this dovetails with all the historical movements in Islamic theology, not all Ash'aris, but particularly a strain in Ash'ari thought that very much paralleled the ideas of Ahl al-Hadith and the ideas of al-Jabriya and the ideas of the Murji'ah, these old theological schools that basically said a despot is God's will and you must accept the despot as God's will, and submission to that reality is fulfillment of divine will and legitimacy itself, which is interesting enough. So, for instance, very quickly, that among Jami and Madkhali Muslims, the only thing they say about people like Trump or people like the entire Macron issues in France is that they're part of God's will, and that understanding that that's the natural order of things in the world is being a good Muslim, that the only option you have is to sabr and to accept it and to follow what Wulat al-Umur. And what they mean by Wulat al-Umur is specifically those that have coercive power in the most unrefined means. I mean, those who possess brute power. I want to very quickly, I'll stop with this, about tyranny and chaos, because this is a constant theme that always you find cited repeatedly in the literature, that 1,000 years of tyranny is better than 1 hour of chaos, and it doesn't surprise me that this type of statement emerges from legalistic literature in history. Very similar statements you can find in Blackstone's commentaries on English law. It is not unusual for legalists, by the nature of the legal profession, to be averse to chaos and to say any type of order is better than lawlessness. That's not unusual in the sociology of law. And people like Richard Abel, who have done a lot of work on comparative sociologies of law, documents this common feature in legal thinking. But when that legalistic attitude that some order is better than uncertainty becomes a entire political theory and the basis of legitimacy, then we have a very serious problem. And after the Arab Spring, I want to underscore, and I'll stop here, that keep in mind that there are powerful economic and political forces that are supporting Jami and Madkhali theology. Interestingly enough, it fits with this entire pro-Arab Islam thing, because United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, in their writings, for instance, say that Islam is only appropriately represented by Arabs, and by Al-Sunnah al-Jama'ah really exists solely among Arabs, and that is why we can exclude the Turks as a corruption. We can exclude Pakistan presently as a corruption, in Pakistan refusing, for instance, to play ball with making peace with Israel and accepting the annexation of Jerusalem and so on. We can exclude even Indonesians and Malaysians to the extent that they don't adhere to the leadership of this clique of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, as again as a corruption. And the Sunnah al-Jama'ah only exists in this core center, what they argue is a core center. But then the leadership of the entire world, it will be a cooperative venture between Wilat al-Umur in Arabia and the natural order of the world, which is dominated by non-Muslims, and which it is you are casting yourself into ruin if you challenge the power of Israelis or the power of Americans or the power of British, that you are committing an actual sin if you attempt to challenge American power or British power or Israeli power, because that is Allah's will. And I think that theology, we would be making a big mistake if we underestimate the impact of that theology.
Very well, thank you very much. I'll come back to you for your final thoughts if you want to add something. But now for Dr. Mamdani, I have one more question from one of our listeners, Uveys Khan, who is senior researcher here at CIGA. And he's asking the following question. He says, you speak about tribes as construction of colonial power, but tribes are part of our region before colonialism and modern constructions. Can tribes be a source of anti-colonial power as social groups that help to break the states and or capital direct society control of individuals, or are they always an obstacle serving in whose name they speak? Dr. Mamdani.
Thank you very much. I find the discussion between my two colleagues very interesting. And I would like to stake a different position, which is with regard to political modernity. At the heart of political modernity is about the nation state. And I think that's the core of our problem today. Rather than embracing political modernity, I think we need to interrogate it. We need to look for alternatives to it. We have been told that first came nationalism, then came colonialism. Nationalism was the good side, colonialism was the bad side. But I think that story is a mythology. Nationalism and colonialism were two sides of the same coin. They came together. They came in 1492. They came when Ferdinand and Isabella adopted methods of ethnic cleansing in order to create a Catholic Spain. They came when at the same time they financed Columbus to move over to the Americas. They led to this confluence of nationalism and colonialism led to huge problems. It led to religious wars. It led to majorities, religious majorities, ethnically cleansing religious minorities. A solution was found in 1640, what we know as the Treaty of Westphalia, but that was a non-solution, because what the Treaty of Westphalia said is that we will have a coupled solution. On the one hand, sovereignty, on the other hand, tolerance. That we will tolerate minorities within, and in return for that, the power will be accorded the status of a sovereign power internationally. What did tolerance mean? John Locke wrote the classical essay on tolerance. That Protestants would tolerate Catholics in England so long as Catholics do not pay homage to the Pope, so long as Catholics give up any political rights, so long as Catholics simply support the existing state and do not think of an alternative to it. Tolerating the minority meant honoring the rights of the minority, but not allowing the minority any participation in power. This remains the problem. Now, let me give you an analogy. Think of the discourse on the Marxist state. The discourse on the Marxist state, very crucial, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution and then after the Chinese Revolution, led to a debate. Who is a Marxist? Who is a Marxist? Sorry, I'm hearing my echo.
Okay, go ahead. I think it's gone.
Who is a Marxist? What is the correct line? And it unleashed a violent struggle inside Marxism. And when the dust settled, you had a political dictatorship. And I suggest to you that those talking of an Islamic state should draw some lessons from this, because the search for an Islamic state, the search to establish one, has raised the same problem. Whose state is an Islamic state? Who is a Muslim? Who is a genuine Muslim and who is not? What does it mean to be a Muslim? Does it mean to have a religious conviction? Does it mean to have a certain social solidarity? Or does it mean to have a political identity? I personally, I have huge questions about thinking of Islam as a political identity. I think that Islam we need to think of as a religious and a social identity. And if we want to think of it as a political identity, we have to first give up the project of creating an Islamic state in the Westphalian mode. And then we have to ask ourselves, is there a political project outside of the nation state that can be a Muslim project? I don't think we have an answer. And I don't think one is possible in a conference, in a sense. And I think there is a second question, which is the majority. Besides the question of the state, it is the question of the majority and the minority. And the majority minority question, excuse me, the screen changed. It's really about non-Muslims in Muslim majority societies and Muslim minorities in non-Muslim societies. These are issues, again, to which we have not given sufficient thought. I will answer one more question posed to me by somebody from the audience, tribes. What I'm talking about, I distinguish between pre-modern and modern tribes. Pre-modern tribes are cultural communities. Pre-modern tribes are not fixated to a particular territory. The fixation of tribe to a particular territory, making tribes, giving tribes a specific territoriality is a very modern colonial phenomenon. And this has tended to politicize tribes. I don't think tribes are necessarily positive or negative. You can read Ibn Khaldun and think of tribes as sources of chaos. but you can also read other historical sources and think of tribes as more than just chaos. But I think I suggest I would like us to think in terms of what colonialism did with what it found on the ground: tribe, customary law, etc.
Very well. Thank you very much. Now to our concluding remarks. Each panelist will get 3 minutes. Dr. Humeira, if you could also, if you can, address the question of how much Western political thought, whether positively or negatively, affected someone like Maududi and his generation of thinkers. Did they swallow wholesale some of these liberal democratic notions that later came under severe critique, even by Western thinkers, not just Muslim thinkers, but also give your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Actually, the question makes me slightly worried that perhaps I didn't do a good job of explaining that Maududi engages with European thought, but also critiques ultimately, many of these ideas. And critique and engagement can go hand in hand. The idea that critique is a rejection is, I think, it's a reductionist and perhaps not entirely accurate idea of how ideas change and ideas are developed. So I think that the earlier question that you'd asked, and perhaps it goes back to some of the things that Professor Mamdani has just raised as well. I think that one of the big failures for Maududi, at least in my mind, is that despite his critique of nationalism, despite his critique of the modern state, or what we might call the Westphalian state, Maududi ultimately also then ends up in the embrace of the state, because he ultimately decides that despite all his skepticism, the state is, perhaps it's like a car. If it has a right driver, it can be taken in the right direction. And this, despite the fact that he recognizes that the state, as an entity, is really difficult to manage and control, but I think he ultimately accepts the state as it is and then tries to work with it. So his initial criticism of it, you start seeing that it starts becoming less and less pronounced. And what becomes more and more important in his arguments is the compatibility of Sharia with the state. And again, that's, I think, another area of failure where I'm very sympathetic to Wael Halak's argument that, what somebody like Maududi did was he took a very wide-ranging, very creative, very diverse ways of thinking about everyday and legal, everyday life, which was one way in which Sharia could operate, and try to codify it and limit it in the service of the state or through the state. And so he certainly created, later on in his life, he really started emphasizing that Sharia is a code of law, and it can be it's entirely compatible with the modern state. And that, of course, was where his own critique started unraveling quite badly. So I think that in that sense, it's quite my argument was never that Maududi's solution should be adopted, but actually the ways in which he makes his argument, the kinds of resources that he brings to the table, and the ways in which he raises questions about nationalism, about the relationship between popular sovereignty and its reliance on nationalism. Those are very important questions, and questions that we still have to address. So thank you very much for a very interesting and very enriching conversation. Thank you for organizing it, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you, and thank you for answering. You answered pretty good. I can tell you that. All right, Dr. Khaled. You're muted. Your final and concluding remarks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, a question that often comes up. I chose to focus on Madkhali and Jami Salafi ideas. What? No, it's because
We can hear fine. Yes.
yeah. So I
Can you
cho-
hear?
yeah, you can.
Okay.
I chose to focus on Madkhali and Jami Salafi ideas because of the role that they have played in Yemen, in Libya, in Tunisia, in Egypt, as a powerful theological movement. But the question that always comes up is how seriously do we take these theological ideas? Because isn't it true that a lot of Sufi movements in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, have also supported autocracy, have also supported military uh, uh, al-askariya, the militarization of society, and also supported non-democratic and opposed the revolution and so on. And so isn't it just true basically that Madkhali and Jami Islam, it's often said, is nothing more than engineered by the state as theologies of despotism, and they are as serious as basically tools of power. But I think it's a mistake to assume that there is ever a theology and law that is independent or somehow not influenced by power. But theology convinces and influences the masses. And one of the effects that we saw after the Arab Spring is how theological ideas were leveraged to delegitimate the idea of democracy, to adopt a reactionary position that any attempt to deal with power in a complex pluralistic fashion or as a political process in the way that Professor Mamdani was speaking about, for instance, in the South African example, that all of these are bid'ah and heresies, and that in fact society must always have a single head and everything must yield itself to that single head. Without the aid of theological ideas, it becomes much more difficult to accomplish. And so I do think theological ideas matter, and they matter a lot. I don't think it is useful to adopt the often elitist position that theological ideas are for the simple-minded and the laity, while we intellectuals are above it, because we really know that theology doesn't matter. I think that's a mistake that scholars and academics often make.
Very good.
So
Thank you.
I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Dr. Khaled. And finally, your final concluding remarks, Dr. Mamdani. Unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Dr. Mamdani, could you unmute yourself, please?
I have.
Okay, very good.
I realize I have to be very alert when facing a screen.
Right.
So look, I have two things to say. First time I read Maududi, I was quite attracted by the idea of sovereignty of God, because I said, finally an idea which makes it clear that there can be no sovereignty on earth. No earthly power can be sovereign. But then I realized that, of course, the discussion about sovereignty of God was really a discussion about who was the rightful representative of God on earth. And it was leading to the same conclusion that the same problem to which we were trying to find a solution. I realized that Maududi, in many ways, when I reread Maududi, I thought then I was I was reading a vernacular version of Lenin's "What is to be done." A manual on how to get power. So I think the problem that Maududi posed, and even before him, Allama Iqbal posed, which is the critique of the nation state, and both of them eventually succumbed to the temptations of the nation state, should pose for us a challenge. What are the alternatives to the nation state? Second thing I want to, and I would say, do not rule out looking through our historical resources, and those are the pre-modern period. I'm not saying that we go and just embrace anything that existed before. I'm not talking of any kind of nativism, but I am talking against a modernism which thinks that history began with modernity or colonialism. The second issue I wanted to talk about is, again, the pre-modern modern. And I had said earlier in my presentation, I'd made a reference to custom. And I work on custom in the African context. And my sense is that custom before colonialism was really a part of society. It wasn't part of the state. It wasn't part of the polity. And custom reflected some kind of a social consensus. There was also diversity of custom, and custom developed constantly. But custom with colonialism became customary law, and customary law became part of the arsenal of the state. And customary law was not supposed to change. Customary law remained stagnant. And I think somewhat of a similar, I mean, when Wael was writing his Sovereignty of God book, I remember in a discussion, he'd given me the draft to read and comment on, and I remember saying to him in a discussion that really, it seemed to me Sharia went through a transformation with colonialism, when Sharia became not just Qanun, but Sharia became an artifact of the state. And then when I read Isa Hussein, who I see is presenting here, her book, when she was at Chicago, and her book was the subject of an author conference. And again, I was one of the people invited to that conference, and I learned enormously by her discussion of the origins of the genealogy of Anglo-Mohammedan law, and how the British created this in a colonial crucible in India, and then sent out representatives and agents to Malaya and to Egypt, and how from Egypt this was transported to Sudan, and from Sudan it was transported to Nigeria. Sharia law was very much a colonial construction in many ways. So that's all I have to say. I mean, look, the discussion continues, the struggle continues, as we say in Africa. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the three of you. This was very fruitful and enlightening discussion. I'm sure a lot of our audience here appreciates your contributions. We're blessed to have you, and we're very grateful for the three of you. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for accepting this and for inaugurating this conference. We have a great start, I believe, and many of the questions raised are going to be the subject of many of the sessions to be had in the next 6 days. Actually, it's a week-long conference. We start today and we end on Friday. So, and because of course of the pandemic, as we said in the first session, we had to start at a particular time, and so that would accommodate as much of the time zones as possible. So again, I want to thank the three of us. For tomorrow, I'm going to remind our audience that we're going to have two sessions tomorrow. The first session will be at 3 o'clock, and the title of that session is Islam and Democracy. Islam and Democracy will have 3 presenters. This was the product of also called for papers. And at 7 o'clock Istanbul time, which is 4 o'clock Greenwich, we're going to have another panel, the title of which is Embracing Democracy. So tomorrow will be about democracy and the notion of democracy. Embracing Democracy, Requirements, Perils, and Prospects. And we'll also have 3 distinguished professors, Dr. Dina Abdul Qadir from the University of Massachusetts, Dr. Ann Norton from the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Nader Hashemi from the University of Denver. Again, good night. Thank you very much for our panelists, and thank you for the audience for being with us today, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Wassalamu alaikum.